Tonight on The Late Debate. Against a backdrop of more demos, more than a dozen London Labour MPs defied their leader to vote for a Gaza ceasefire. We ask if the Commons rebellion has inflicted lasting damage on Sir Keir Starmer.
You wouldn't expect me to stand here today and say my concern is the Labour Party management rather than the hostages.
Also tonight, could London run out of room to house refugees? We speak to a council eyeing up new flats as part of the solution.
And that's somewhere that Ukrainian and Afghan families will be able to rent. They'll be able to start their lives here properly.
Hey, whoa, what are you doing?
And with ULEZ still stirring up anger, we ask what the political cost might be ahead of next year's mayoral elections. Hello and welcome to The Late Debate. The message from 15 London Labour MPs came loud and clear. In a vote that threatened to dent Sir Keir Starmer's authority, they say the Labour leader got it wrong over his response to the Israel-Gaza war. Starmer wants a humanitarian pause to get aid into Gaza, but he failed to unite many in his party who called for a total ceasefire.
Of course, I want us to move forward as united as we can as a party. But you wouldn't expect me to stand here today and say my concern is the Labour Party management rather than the hostages and the innocent civilians and children that are dying in Gaza.
All this against a noisy backdrop of more protests both at Westminster and Hyde Park Corner, where pro-Palestinian protesters were seen climbing on a war memorial. The actions sparked criticism, but police said no laws were broken.
What is going through a person's mind when they're jumping on this memorial, particularly this time of year? Any time of year is unacceptable. So I think, we've got to understand that's not the behaviour of decent citizens in a civilised country like our country.
The explicit things about last night, it is not illegal to climb onto a statue. I think that might be something that government may consider, but that's for them to decide, not for me.
To discuss that and other issues in the capital, our Labour MP for Streatham, Bel Ribeiro Addy. For the Conservatives, the man who replaced Boris Johnson in Uxbridge and South Ruislip, Steve Tuckwell, and for the Lib Dems, Chesham and Amersham MP Sarah Green. Bel, you were a rebel last night. Why?
Well, for me, it wasn't about party politics. It was about showing our common humanity. And what we've seen over the past few weeks has been absolutely awful. Now, the death toll's past 11,000. We've seen the killing of thousands of children. These people shouldn't be made to pay for Hamas's crimes.
But the Labour Party calling for a ceasefire isn't going to make any difference in Tel Aviv, is it?
But the Labour Party not calling for a ceasefire, I think, it's something that people right across the country are not necessarily happy about. To say that it's not going to make a difference, so we're not going to say anything, I think is the wrong approach.
Is this because Labour MPs like you in inner city constituencies are more worried about the electoral consequences rather than the moral consequences?
No, I'm concerned about the moral consequences, but I do recognise the electoral consequences. For me personally, as far as I'm concerned, the best way to ensure that, we get aid into Gaza, that Palestinians stop being killed, and actually I think the best way to start the process of making sure that Israeli hostages are secured with is actually this ceasefire. I don't think that not having a ceasefire is going to make any of those things any easier.
Steve, you must accept that at some point this war has to end, and that's likely to be with a ceasefire. So why aren't British political parties, including your party, the government, pushing for a ceasefire, even if they're not saying it should happen now?
Well, I think we would all like to see a ceasefire. Everybody in that chamber last night would like to see a ceasefire. But when you've got a terrorist organisation who have publicly said that they will not comply with a ceasefire, then I think calling for a ceasefire would only lead to more bloodshed, and that's what we don't want. So I think when you've got Hamas who's saying we're not going to comply with any ceasefire, you need two parties, you need both sides to be able to say we want the same thing, we're going to comply with that. One side has said they're not going to do that, which is just going to lead to more bloodshed.
Liking a ceasefire is one thing. Calling for a ceasefire would give it a powerful voice.
Well, I think, again, it would also allow for Hamas to rearm itself, and then we would be seeing more devastating attacks like we saw on the 7th of October.
Sarah, we hear a lot from MPs that their email inboxes are full from their constituents asking for a ceasefire. Are you hearing that out in Chesham and Hamersham?
In Chesham and Hamersham, this is easily the issue that has exercised people the most in the time that I've been elected. It's true what you've heard.
Well, even more than you, Liz?
More than you, Les, believe it or not. But I can understand why. When we look at the footage of what is happening, how can you not be moved? How can you not feel emotional about it? And that's what I am seeing in my constituency, is that heightened sense of emotion, which is why this weekend on Remembrance Sunday, I thought it was important for us as politicians to soothe those emotions rather than stoke them. And I think it's I think it's shameful that the Home Secretary at the time did what she did and effectively stoked those emotions rather than soothed them.
Did you agree with what Suella Braverman said?
Well, it's certainly not a language set that I would use, but we've got a Home Secretary who's in place now who is very seasoned at what he's doing, and he's already starting to make a difference as the new Home Secretary.
Sarah, you talk about calling for a ceasefire. Your party is the only one of the three major parties to call for that. What do the Lib Dems know that Labour and the Conservatives don't know?
Well, it's not an easy thing to call for, and I don't think anyone is suggesting that calling for a bilateral ceasefire is an easy thing to do. But what it does do, by the international community calling for that, it would allow aid into Gaza. It would allow a space for those hostages to be released, and it would also allow space for that political conversation to start to happen. Because what we want to see is a world where Palestinians and Israelis can live side by side in peace in a two-state solution. That doesn't happen if you don't have that bilateral ceasefire.
Belle, you've got a safe seat, but do you predict that some London Labour MPs might actually lose their seats because of this split?
No, I don't predict any London Labour MPs will lose their seats at all. I predict that we're going to do very well in the next general election. But the issue that we're talking about here is a humanitarian one. And absolutely, I just can't see how we're going to move forward to peace, as Sarah's just said, if we don't stop the bombing, if we don't stop the killing.
But do you worry that other parties like Look for Rahman's Aspire party in Tower Hamlets might stand against Labour MPs, and we might see a repeat of what happened in Bethnal Green and Bow when George Galloway won it over Labour?
No, I'm not worried about that at all. My huge concern at the moment, as is many of my constituents, is what's happening in Israel and Gaza at the moment, and how the world, the international community, is going to move forward to a situation where people stop dying.
Sarah, you mentioned demonstrations. We saw another one outside Parliament last night, and that moved to those scenes in Hyde Park Corner where the Royal Artillery Monument was climbed upon by one Palestinian protester. Do you think there should be tougher laws to control protesters to stop this sort of thing happening?
We have laws that the police can use if they choose to. Some of the changes to the protest laws that we saw earlier this year, I voted against because I thought the police had the rules that they needed at the time. The police didn't call for these rules and these. A right to protest in this country is fundamental to our democracy, and I think it might be unsavoury, we might not like it, and I certainly didn't like the scenes that I saw, but our right to protest is fundamental, and I think the law is where it needs to be right now.
You probably agree with Sadiq Khan, Steve, that he says what happened was uncivilised. Do you think the laws should be toughened up?
Well, Sadiq Khan is responsible for policing in our great city, and he's the Police and Crime Commissioner. He needs to be having those conversations with Sir Mark Rowley about how more robust policing can be achieved in our capital. But we heard
from Sir Mark Rowley, he said they haven't got the power to stop protesters climbing onto war memorials.
I also heard the Home Secretary today address a police meeting where he was keen and eager to listen to the police and equip them with what they need. So I think, again, the Police and Crime Commissioner for London is Sadiq Khan. He needs to be having those conversations with Sir Mark Rowley about how they can police robustly and consistently across our capital.
Do you think tougher laws are needed?
No, absolutely, I don't. I think they have all the legislation that they need to do what they need to do. Fundamentally, our right to protest has to be protected. And if somebody is doing something that is unsavoury or that is wrong, there are sufficient powers to stop them from doing that.
And have you been on any pro-Palestine marches?
I have, and largely they have been peaceful, more peaceful than your average football match. So I think all of the tensions that the former Home Secretary was stoking were absolutely irresponsible. The only hate marches were the ones that she herself kind of stoked up, and actually you'll see a wide range of people came out. Some arrests were made, as would be expected, but they were largely peaceful protests.
She did stoke up tensions, didn't she, Steve?
Well, again, as I said, it's language that I would not use, and I think, you know...
But do you acknowledge that things are worse because of her language?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think we'll actually get to that point to know what actually did or didn't happen. But again, it's not language I would use. But certainly, the right to protest needs to be protected. But we also need to do it robustly and consistently across our capital.
Well, while MPs have been preoccupied with the outcome of yesterday's Rwanda ruling, London councils face the growing challenge of where to accommodate the growing number of refugees starting a new life in the capital. But with a squeeze on housing, there are no easy answers. One council has been eyeing up the prospect of renting out new-build flats as they look for ways to ease the pressure. August 2021 and the exodus from Afghanistan was only the beginning of a long journey for refugees fleeing the Taliban.
This is me. I've changed a lot.
Brothers Jawed and Urshad finally moved into a house in Leighton with the rest of their family in August. But for much of the 2 years since fleeing Kabul, they've lived in hotels.
Living in the hotel for over 1.5 years wasn't the easiest task. And especially studying in a hotel is really not the greatest of experiences.
You need a permanent address, which we didn't have. Like, we couldn't even get our licenses, driving licenses with the hotel address because it was commercial. We couldn't get our bank accounts open.
The Siddiqui family's new home is in the London borough of Waltham Forest, where the local council has ambitions to be designated a borough of sanctuary. That means it welcomes refugees and asylum seekers. The council is planning to buy around 200 flats, including new builds, to rent to Afghan and Ukrainian families. It's spending £80 million.
Once that accommodation is no longer needed by Afghan and Ukrainian families, we'll be able to use that accommodation to address need on our own housing list.
The pressure on councils to offer more accommodation is growing. Anyone granted refugee status faces a deadline.
They now have just 7 days to leave their accommodation and find privately rented accommodation. 7 days is simply not possible to get everything in order. It's certainly not possible to find work, save a deposit, and then find a property where you can actually rent.
The Siddiqui brothers know they're among the lucky ones.
For us, for me, London and this house is proving to be like the best thing that happened after we came here.
Mostly I miss the weather, the people, and just the way life was, you know. I don't think it will be ever like that again.
The family gave up a comfortable middle-class life in Kabul. It wasn't out of choice. Steve, you've been a councillor in Hillingdon. What pressure is your authority under?
Well, I think, you know, local authorities are under pressure with this very, very complex situation with legal migrants and legal refugees. And I think we've heard today, you know, from the Home Secretary that there are good processes going to be put in place to ensure that councils are supported in integrating, you know, refugees into our society.
Bill, you're an MP in Lambeth. Lambeth already is a borough of sanctuary. What does that mean? Is it any more than just virtue signalling?
Well, under this government, unfortunately, there's very little extra that we can do, but it means that we actually are more welcoming to people who are seeking refuge in our area. It means we're more mindful of it. Unfortunately, at the moment, with the amount of resources and the cuts to council budgets, this has been very, very difficult. We have issues as London MPs with housing overall, and I think it's really problematic the way in which the government are spinning things in terms of housing for refugees. And actually a lot of the private companies they've got involved in providing some of these services. I think we need to look towards being able to build more housing right across London overall, but also not allowing people to just buy all these houses, flats and houses off plan, leave all of them empty and actually create a housing crisis which also doesn't help with the residents already in the borough, and then on top of that doesn't help when we're attempting to find somewhere for refugees to stay.
Sarah, you represent a stereotypically middle-class part of the home counties, a former Tory seat. Would your voters embrace the idea of your local council, Buckinghamshire, becoming a council of sanctuary?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that the outpouring of desire to help those Ukrainian refugees when they first came to this country, I was blown away by it, and I suspect that if the idea was floated to them, they wouldn't immediately reject it.
Steve, are we welcoming enough?
I think that our country is incredibly welcoming to legal migrants and illegal refugees rather, and I think we've shown that over the decades that we are very welcoming, and I think we need to be doing more to ensure that we can integrate these people into our society, because they have a place that they can contribute.
Do you think Steve's got it right, that we are welcoming enough?
I think we have historically been welcoming. I don't think we are at the moment. The constant use of the word illegal is a problem. When someone is seeking refuge, they are not illegal. I don't believe any person is illegal. So that language, I think, has to stop. I think it does inflame a lot of tensions. And I don't think at the moment, looking at the Rwanda deal, looking at the rhetoric from the 8 Home Secretaries we've had in the past 8 years, that we are really being the welcoming nation that we have historically been.
Steve, will the Home Secretary, the new Home Secretary, James Cleverly, stop the boats?
Yes, he has a clear plan. He's already started to work on it already. So I think we'll be seeing in the coming days what that plan will look like, and I think we will be seeing, illegal asylum seekers returned somewhere, possibly in the spring.
So he doesn't have a plan?
He does have a plan, yes.
Okay. What's the plan? Sorry, that's your job.
What's Labour's plan to stop the boats?
Labour, I think, have been very, very clear about looking at stopping the people traffickers. That's the ultimate thing. The rhetoric that the Tories have used in terms of stopping the boats is all passed on to the individuals that are trying to flee, and that's not fair. You have to look at the people that are trafficking these people over. You need to look at a lot of the applications that perhaps could be made on the other side of the border. I think Labour could definitely do more. Nobody's saying that, but we are not the party of government at the moment. They say they have a plan, they don't have a plan, and they're being really, really reactionary and awful when it comes to refugees.
And Sarah, what's the Lib Dems' answer to immigration and migration?
So on the asylum seeker point, one of the challenges we face is the huge backlog of people applying and waiting in the system, which is feeding into that need for housing. If we invested the money that's been wasted on certain projects into actually having the caseworkers needed to process those asylum claims, we wouldn't have the length of time people are in hotels in the first place.
Is that a point that there isn't enough money to end the backlog?
Oh, I think the backlog is going to be tackled, and we will start to see that backlog come down. But just to answer the point around what Labour's response to that would be to do a deal with the European Union and see us overwhelmed with even more people coming from other countries. So I think James Cleverly has a very clear plan. It was announced yesterday in the House. We're doing some more work on a treaty with Rwanda to make sure that becomes a legal mechanism, and by the spring we'll be seeing a proper plan in place, and those boats will stop.
And when will the first plane to Rwanda be? Will there ever be one?
The announcement will be coming out very, very soon, but there will be a very firm plan in place.
Steve, you were only elected this year on a ULEZ bounce in the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election. But since then, we've seen both Labour and the Liberal Democrats taking seats in other parts of the country. Was that just a blip? Is the ULEZ bounce confined to London for one by-election?
Well, as I said in my maiden speech earlier this week, ULEZ played a big part in a by-election victory for myself, but there were other local issues which also came into the mix, which got me to be sitting as a Member of Parliament for Uxbridge and South Ruislip.
But do you recognise that perhaps ULEZ issues might not roll out across the whole of the country in the general election in the way that the Tories seem to think they might do?
Well, I think certainly what we see from ULEZ is a completely out-of-touch Mayor of London who just completely ignored my constituency and Outer London in general. He's still continuing to press ahead, and we've seen protests, and we've seen lots of anger and frustration about how ULEZ is devastating households and devastating local businesses.
There are MPs, even in your party, who aren't happy with Sadiq's plan to extend the ultra-low emissions zone. Are you worried that it's going to cost votes at the general election?
I'm worried about people and I suppose their reaction to it. we do need to have measures like ULEZ and other traffic calming measures and measures overall that help in terms of our environment. But the most important thing is to make sure that these work best with people. And I think some tweaks
do you think Sadiq's are working? You say tweaks. What tweaks?
I think in some areas some tweaks can be made. I think we definitely need to be able to invest more in the scrappage scheme, for example, which is something that Sadiq has actually done. But the more we could would be much better, because people need to be able to afford it. There are so many things that can be done, but so many things that are going to be more difficult whilst we have the Conservatives in government.
You're nodding your head in agreement. You think the scrappage scheme should be expanded to presumably constituents outside London?
Exactly. There are NHS workers and social workers living in my constituency who commute in and are caught into the ULEZ scheme, and they weren't eligible for the scrappage scheme, and they've been hit twice, if that makes sense. So I think if we all want the capital to have clean air, but if you're going to introduce something as fast as the Mayor has, you need to make sure that those mitigations are in place.
And there is still money left in the scrappage scheme, but it's still not available to people in your constituency.
Exactly.
Steve, we saw earlier this week a lady driving instructor knocked over as she took part in a protest against one of those mobile ULEZ cameras. We've seen quite a lot of those protests. In your part of the world, do you see these people trying to stop the cameras, frustrate them, people dressing up as dinosaurs, standing in front of cameras?
Yeah, dressing up as a dinosaur is unique, I think. But what was also quite concerning was the Mayor of London was asked that question about the incident you referred to this morning, and he was not aware of it. So it just goes to show how the Mayor of London he's completely out of touch.
Well, no, come on. I mean, he can't be aware of every single incident that happens right across the city, every single one.
Well, this is quite a high-profile incident, so I think he should get a grip.
I think that is unfair. I mean, criticise the scheme if you want to, but I mean that's quite unfair, I think.
Well, I think we're also going to look at how the Mayor of London has ignored your constituents, he's ignored your constituents, he's ignored my constituents, he's ignored Outer London completely, and he's pressing ahead with his devastating, disastrous ULEZ expansion, which isn't needed.
But there's no sign at the moment that he's going to change it, and the latest opinion poll shows him a good 25 points ahead of the Conservative candidate. If she can't win the election, and at the moment the polls are saying she's not going to.
I was 22 points behind in the by-election poll, so there we go. But we've also just got to be looking at how devastating the consequences of ULEZ have been. And I've heard many Labour MPs calling for an early general election. Well, let's call for an early mayoral election and see what Londoners really think about the mayor.
I'm told that the reason people dress up in dinosaur suits is because they're 8 foot high, and that's the same height as a mobile camera. Anyway, that's all tonight. Thank you to my guests, Belle Ribeiro-Addy, Steve Tuckwell and Sarah Green. We'll be back next month for the final programme of the year. Until then, good night and thank you for watching.